Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
For centuries, Native American land has been stripped away, not just through warfare and forced removal, but through legal manipulation and systemic exploitation. The tragic and complex history of indigenous land dispossession in the United States is one of broken treaties, fraudulent legislation, and calculated economic pressure. This is a story not just of conquest, but of a systematic erosion of indigenous sovereignty, using the very laws that were supposed to protect native land. The removal of Native Americans from their ancestral lands did not end with Andrew Jackson's infamous Indian Removal Act of 1830, nor with the forced relocations of the Trail of Tears. Rather, the 19th and 20th centuries saw an evolution of more insidious means to strip native peoples of their land through legal loopholes and governmental policies designed to assimilate and dissolve indigenous identities. The Dawes Act of 1887 was perhaps the most infamous example, reducing communal landholdings and breaking them into individual allotments, many of which were later sold to white settlers. But even before and after this, mechanisms such as treaty violations, land cessions under duress, and Supreme Court decisions that favored the expansion of U.S. territory contributed to a long and painful process of dispossession. One of the most devastating aspects of this legal war on Native American land ownership was the use of land trusts and guardianship programs, which allowed non-native individuals to oversee indigenous assets, often leading to fraud and loss of property. The General Allotment Act of 1887 alone led to the loss of two-thirds of indigenous land in just a few decades. Native land was also targeted through eminent domain, resource exploitation, and even tax policies that burdened tribal communities with financial obligations designed to push them into selling their land. The legal manipulation did not stop in the 19th century. Even in the 20th and 21st centuries, land rights continue to be contested in courts. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 attempted to reverse some of the damage by ending allotment, but by that time, the majority of indigenous land had already been lost. The ongoing struggles over land rights, pipeline construction, and reservation boundaries reflect the enduring legacy of these policies. To understand the true cost of these legal loopholes, one must acknowledge the persistent resistance of Native American communities and their fight to reclaim sovereignty. In the wake of the American Civil War, the Reconstruction era was a time of great hope for formerly enslaved people, but also a period of intense racial violence. The Colfax Massacre of April 13, 1873, stands as one of the most brutal episodes of that era. What began as a contested election in Louisiana ended in a slaughter that exposed the limits of federal power and the fragility of black political rights in the post-war South. The massacre was rooted in political tensions between white supremacist Democrats and the newly enfranchised black Republicans who sought to exercise their rights in the Reconstruction South. The 1872 gubernatorial election in Louisiana resulted in two rival governments, with the Republican William Kellogg and the Democrat John McHenry both claiming victory. Grant Parish, a predominantly black area, became a flashpoint when African-American freedmen, fearing violence from white paramilitary groups, took control of the local courthouse to assert their allegiance to the Republican government. On April 13, 1873, a heavily armed white mob, composed of former Confederate soldiers and members of the White League, descended upon the courthouse. After a standoff, the attackers overran the building, setting it on fire and executing many of the black defenders. Some were shot as they surrendered, while others were brutally lynched in the aftermath. Estimates suggest that between 60 and 150 black men were killed, making it one of the worst instances of racial violence in American history. The federal government initially responded with arrests and prosecutions under the Enforcement Acts, which were designed to suppress Ku Klux Klan violence and protect black civil rights. However, in 1876, the U.S. Supreme Court case United States versus Cruikshank effectively nullified the federal charges, ruling that the 14th Amendment did not grant the federal government the power to prosecute individuals for civil rights violations. This decision severely weakened Reconstruction efforts and set a precedent that allowed racial terror to flourish in the South. The Colfax Massacre signaled the beginning of the end of federal intervention in Southern racial violence and paved the way for the Jim Crow era. It was a stark reminder that legal rights on paper meant little when the government lacked the will to enforce them. The massacre remains a haunting example of how white supremacy used both violence and the legal system to strip African Americans of their newfound rights, echoing the same tactics used against Native Americans in their land struggles.